think time is short. We should quickly get on with what we want to do here. And I thought maybe we could have this discussion in sort of two sections. In the first section, I would like my colleagues to reflect on this symposium and tell us about their experience of the symposium, also the highlights of the symposium, and maybe if they can briefly introduce themselves as well. We have like 3-4 minutes for each of you, so please. Herman, maybe you can start. Yes?
Yeah, probably my first comment is I'm deeply impressed from the Korean hospitality. It's the first time I'm here, and yeah, it's really nice to be here. And thank you again so much. I can speak to the degree to which I was able to follow the presentations. It's been quite hard to kind of split between sessions, and to the extent what I could read a few abstracts. But my first sort of impression that I got that made me quite pleased and happy was the extent to which this community has come to address increasingly wide range of topics that range from the architectural scale to urban scale, all the way to, let's say, to the continental international scale between countries and cities, and making bridges to disciplines in ecology, in geography, in psychology, cognitive science. So that was my first impression that makes me believe that this community is still into producing healthy and interesting works.
Thank you. My name is Giorgio. I'm from TU Delft. Still a PhD student, no doctor, no professor. Thank you for covering my first topic. And also, I have to mention hospitality as one of the highlights. For me, the main highlight was an amazing dinner, actually, the other night after the tour of the city. So I'm not going to go into details, but that was a very excellent example of Korean hospitality. So going to the second topic, apart from the diversity of themes that I've noticed being covered, especially I'd like to touch on those that address directly things to do with performance, be it ecological, sustainable, related to sustainability, CO2 emissions, and those topics that are quite relevant. I think that's important to bring relevant topics to our research. That leads to the issue of scales that was also touched, because we've seen definitely the range of scales of studies increasing. That also challenges us to look at the relational nature of these scales and how we can now, with this large-scale works, we start having big data, or another topic that was covered. So big data, not only the data that we take into the study, but also the data that is produced by our work. So when we start doing these large studies, we should be also producing large amounts of important material for others to take on and research with our models and with our results. And just as a final point that was mentioned on the first day, with this evolution, we are looking at understanding a lot, the need for understanding this big data. And I've seen in many of the presentations many new questions being raised by the steps that we're taking, many new needs for understanding that will look over the future.
I won't go into a lot of detail about thanking the hosts because Herman and Jorge have done such a great job. But the one thing I will say is this has been my first visit to Korea, and the one impression that I'm taking away with me is a strong hope that this won't be my last visit. I suppose I've very much been remembering the fact that I was present at the very first Space Syntax Symposium, which is now 18 years ago, which is a somewhat sobering thought. And for various reasons, I haven't attended as many of the symposia in the last few years as I would have liked to. So I think it was with a certain degree of trepidation that I came to Korea, not being too sure what state I would find the Space Syntax community to be in. And to say that I've been pleasantly surprised would be an understatement. The observations I've made of the last few days is that I've seen a number of things taking place. I've certainly seen leaps forward driven by extremely interesting and exciting questions. I've also seen a desire to fill in gaps where gaps have been perceived. But I've also seen a great willingness to go back and sometimes challenge some of the original foundations of the field that we're in. And my interpretation of this is that it's a sign of an extremely mature and dynamic community. This is certainly not an academic field that is stagnated or a field that's complacent, and this makes me extremely confident in the future. The other thing that I'd like to say about the last few days, I've sat in some really fascinating talks. I'm not going to mention any of them in detail, but as fascinating as the talks have been, what I've found most stimulating is the discussions afterwards. And these have been stimulating, motivating, and extremely exciting. And I almost would have wished for more debate and more discussion and less presentation.
This was also my first visit in Korea, and thank you very much for the hospitality and excellent organization. For those of us that are going to host the next symposium, the challenges raised enormously. And I was also impressed by the level of work, the diversity as well, and I can see certain tendencies, definitely mapping and analyzing at larger scale, looking inside the discipline, focusing on how we can extend, improve our discipline so as to analyze larger systems with greater levels of complexity and exactitude. But also look outside and make links with other disciplines, which are diverse, other areas of knowledge, design, geography, the humanities, and so on. There was also a session that addressed how we can go into areas that we still can't understand, and other papers that dealt with issues like memory, for example, fascinating ideas. It is important to remember that things that we cannot know, we cannot measure. This does not mean that they are not important. Perhaps they are less important exactly because they are more important exactly because we cannot capture them and describe them. Regarding the future.
Maybe we can take some questions or some comments before we discuss that. Any more comments from the audience? Thank you.
I just see one thing coming up is the role where GIS is getting a stronger role. You know, that the integration of the spatial analysis tools and GIS. Do some of you have comments on that one?
Let's see. But it's a nice observation. I think you've all noticed that. It's certainly an area that is growing. Okay, maybe I think this is yeah. Joshua.
Are we going to do the roundabout?
I think so. I think this is time to move to the next round, which is about the future of space syntax. And as Ruth put it very eloquently, this is a very thriving sort of academic community which is linked with also practices, and is making an impact basically. But naturally, we have to think about the future, and if we want to thrive more and don't stagnate, so we need to think about the future. There are issues that we discussed in previous symposiums. I remember, is space syntax now a discipline, or we are still within other disciplines, or are we linking with other fields of research sufficiently, or we are still isolated kind of research field. So these questions are there, and what are the challenges of our future research? And in fact, what are the strengths of? We shouldn't forget about the strengths. It's not all about challenges, but let's appreciate what we've achieved as well. So if you would like to comment on the future of space syntax and how you see it, yes.
That's quite a hard task, but I would probably like to follow on the presentations by Alan Bennett and John Bonis, how we are sort of trying to sort of bridge the gap between humanities and exact sciences, and what John calls the need to simplify space syntax alongside the progress and development of new measures and techniques. And I would say I'm speaking as a person who spends most of his day teaching architecture students, as many of us in the room I think do the same, or most of us come from academia. And I would like to put probably these two sort of main comments that came from Ben's and Bonis' presentations about, as from my point of view, let's say, the need to kind of simplify and bring to the early architectural education key ideas for space syntax. If we have to challenge the future of our relationship with the profession, rather than finding ways to communicate with architects at a sort of late age, as we are trying to do now, is we might have a kind of better chance to teach those guys this foreign language probably at an earlier age, and who can do it better than some of us who are both involved in teaching studios alongside the developing space syntax. I speak as someone that unfortunately missed the first workshop that Daniel organized on the space syntax and pedagogy, but I see that as a concern coming from my daily sort of routine of teaching in architecture studio.
In fact, it was brought up this question of is space syntax something that should be taught at the postgraduate level or undergraduate level, and I think most of us thought that the earlier we start with the concept, not with the techniques.
Exactly. I'm not talking about scatter plots and regression, but some of the early concepts, are quite important to be brought at my point of view, is at the early stage of architecture education.
So what is the future then? What do you see the future of?
Well, I would see probably as small steps that each one can take to undertake projects of integrating these ideas into, let's say, studio development. And so probably we might suggest a second unit next time we meet, where we can bring our sort of own experiences and begin, I would say, conversation. At least both of us are open, even though we might not have solutions.
Thanks, everyone.
Sure. And so following from my pleasure and surprise to see new things, new scales and data, one of the things I see for the future is that we will start to have to seriously think about new models in terms of new theories to address these new challenges, because I think we've come to a point where we find in some cases people still applying your theories, that they're trying to force them and adjust them into working in case studies when it starts begging to take them forward. So, and I think the models need to be supported by theory. You can't just go forward blindly. You need to really reflect. But new models in terms of theories, but also new maps, new graphs. We need to, and we've seen some of that. We need to more consistently address those. And so these new models and the new types of data that we start to see also require new methods of analysis, be it statistical or spatial. And this links to the point that Aki raised about the GIS. Definitely we see that a lot. And I think it's fundamental as one of the main tools to deal with spatial data. And we're all about spatial data and large quantities of it. So I think that is a fundamental tool to contribute to these new methods. And also the aspect of visualization. We talk a lot about the colors. And we many times take the default colors for granted when we use the tools. But I think the visualization aspects are also something that needs to evolve and grow more in terms of being conscious of the numbers behind the colors and what kinds of visualizations we can use to visualize those numbers, and not just trust the default that comes with some software. And so these new models and methods, one suggestion, and it was mentioned collaboration, I think it's fundamental not to just ignore what's already there, but definitely collaborate with other fields, especially when you're addressing themes that other experts from other fields are addressing. They might have clues to contribute to these models and these methods. So looking at existing fields and adapting those models, at the same time contributing and integrating our knowledge and our specificities back to those fields. So I definitely think that as much as we need to grow and learn these new things, we need to collaborate and integrate. But as a final thing, this collaboration requires communication. So there's an issue with language. We use a very specific language, which sometimes is a barrier to communicate with other experts. Sometimes they're doing very similar, and I found them very similar things that they've been doing for years. They don't even know that we've done, simply because maybe the words, the jargon that we use in our discipline are different. When they do a course, they don't find our literature. So we should become more aware if we want to publish and interact and communicate with others, to see if we can find commonalities in the language we use. A final point, you mentioned looking back at the basis of things. But I think, and Bill also on the first day mentioned looking back at the axial map. And I was very pleased to hear that, in the sense that I think with this collaboration, integration, dissemination, there could be a danger of a dilution of the origins. And I think it's also important to consolidate and crystallize almost the core, what is the core space syntax, so that when we go and share with others, we can confidently bring that knowledge and they can clearly understand what is that contribution.
Thanks, sir.
When Caden very kindly gave us an advance warning of the questions he was going to ask, I scribbled some notes about what my hopes for the future of the syntax community would be. And I came up with a single word, and that's bliss. Maybe I'm an optimist, but in fact bliss is an acronym. So the B is for balance. Again, this is making reference back to Bill's opening talk. If you remember, Bill was talking about space syntax as a theory of description, and how, as such, it comprised of four aspects: representation, analysis, models, and theories. And it struck me as I was listening to Bill that I think the times as a community that we've been weakest is when we've got far too obsessed with any one of those. And I think the way to move forward is to make sure that we don't forget that actually what we do is about these four corners. four pillars of what we do. And I think as we move forward into the future, we should strive to have a balance between those four. And then if we start to get too obsessed with any one of those, and this is why, as excited as I am about the big data, I think it also worries me if we get too obsessed with the big data without the accompanying theories. So the B is for balance. The L is for links, and very much as George just said, I see this as links with other communities. And to use a graph theoretic term, I see these as both outward links but also inward links. The outward links are about the way that we present ourselves to other communities. And again, I was going to make the same point about language, the language we use, and I've been very impressed that I have seen the difference at this symposium. That we are beginning to use language that's less jargon-based, and I would really encourage us in the future to continue with that. But in terms of inward links, I also think it's important for us to be open to contributions from other fields and to be welcoming to potential visitors, colleagues, collaborators coming to us from different disciplines. The I is for issues. Maybe I have been reminiscing a lot while I've been here. So it struck me that the world that we inhabit today is very radically different from what was going on in the world in the early 70s when space syntax began, and very different from the world that we inhabited in the early 90s when the first space syntax symposium took place in London. There are some really worrying problems out there at the moment, particularly economic and social. And I don't think that as a community we should be afraid of tackling some of these problems. I really don't. I would really urge people to take some of these big issues, these big problems, and look them in the face and see how as a community we might begin to address some of these. And finally, the S is for, this is my favourite, is the subject. I actually think what makes space syntax unique is the fact that we have the subject, the human, the user, the participant, whatever you care to call them. We have this person at the heart of everything we do. And okay, in recent years I've been doing a lot of work in cognitive science and psychology, so for me this has been particularly central to my research. But I see it in everything that people do in space syntax, and I think this is something we shouldn't forget. So there's my recipe for the future. Yes.
It sounds like the best souvenir that we can take to our home. Please. Okay.
Very elegant. I would also start from languages and Alan's interest in uniting the humanities with the arts and the sciences. Lastly, very interesting observation in this paper this morning that we need to understand the languages of the different disciplines in order to begin understand how we can make links. And with languages, I don't refer to terminology or the terms we use and how we can make those more accessible, but what systems of representation, that was last point, what systems of representation are used by different disciplines. The same applies to design. Design is a knowledge, is an activity, and it has its own systems of representation in languages, and we ought to understand better if we want to make a link with space syntax in the future. I saw a tendency to see everything as networks growing, which is another suggestion that came from last again, that networks perhaps is a common language. But I think that what makes us different is in this geometry and the social and the cognitive. So how geometry restricts or enables topology and behavior is very important, very specific to us, and that's what distinguishes us from the rest of approaches that use networks. We have been focusing a lot on the social performance and functional performance, which is great, but there are other kinds of performances in buildings and cities, including aesthetic performance. I don't see it as aesthetics, as things that have to look good. There's something wider and more encompassing, which is called aesthetic performance, and I believe that we all try and understand how it links to and the social to see John Peponis going back to buildings and coming with that analysis, comparative understanding of buildings. We know a lot about cities. It's time we start focusing on buildings in a more intensive way in order to establish comparative understanding in this sense as well. That raises a wider issue regarding which discipline. We might relate to many disciplines, but we might have to understand which are the disciplines we have closer links to, if not just one. But which are those, and architecture is an important one from the point of view of physical configuration, considering physical configuration, the ways in which we describe buildings and cities, rather than abstract networks or socio-economic patterns like other disciplines just looking at these instructions. But we find increasingly difficult, I believe, to communicate with people that do the design. Disciplines might collaborate in designing areas, urban areas and buildings, but a master plan and architecture is still designed by designers and architects.
Wonderful. I really don't have anything to add to this, but I would like you to participate a little bit in this discussion. So if there is any comments or any questions that you would pose to Montana. Alan.
Thanks very much. I think those are very optimistic words, particularly Ruth's. I think there's another way to think about the future. The thing that I've observed is that other fields they're hot on our heels. The physicists are now into complexity and networks. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they weren't particularly, but I suppose the rest of physics has dried up, so they've got to move into the social sciences. The geographers now have data, so the big data and GIS mean that people have access to these things from those fields. I think that the social sciences, there's been a spatial turn in the social sciences. I remember in the earlier days of syntax, to get anyone in the social sciences to be interested in space was almost impossible. Now, it's what everybody's talking about. So I think that there's a big kind of context within which we're working, where a lot of other fields are going to be able or in a position and have an interest in making links to the field that is being developed here out of architecture. The other side to this is that the world is changing. So, again, 20 years ago, people didn't have mobile phones. Now, people are connected all over the world as we talk. This conference is being tweeted and people in London are following those tweets. That's something which is radical in its social implications. And I don't think that we've really scratched the surface on the relationship between the architecture of space that we inhabit, the buildings and the cities, and the technologies that now create the transspatial network, which is central to society. So I think the revisiting or the rebuilding of the underlying social logic now needs to take account of these. And I think that will be a direction in which things will go in the future. So I think it's tremendously powerful, and I would agree with the earlier comment that say this conference seems to have shown a kind of coming of age, actually, of people from around the world doing radical innovation in the methodology and in the approach in a way that I didn't see in previous conferences. I think in previous conferences there have been a small number of centres where innovation is taking place, and a much larger number sort of doing repeats of previous results. Now everybody's innovating, and I think this is fascinating.
Excellent. Any of you would like to comment on Alan's comments? No? So more from the audience then. Yes.
I wonder how you see the future of space syntax in combination with this new technologies of generative design. A revolution has happened globally. And every year, for instance, in FUDA, we are educating almost a group of around 60 students with a very systematic education of computational design, design and so on. And for instance, we recently released the plugin for space syntax applied in generative design. How do you see the future in that sense?
Yes, this is a very good question. Perhaps I should have added, in addition to understanding languages, we should understand technologies and new approaches to design generation. And we have definitely a lot of work to do on that front. We've started working on that, and there were posters and papers that showed some very interesting approaches in relation to this. But it's early stages. And we have a great deal of work.
It is also difficult to say it's a revolution or it's just a fashion, or you have to wait and see. But I agree with Sophia that we need to think back, and you already started thinking. And you already developed some tools.
I'd like to add something. I'm not so sure we should sit and wait. As Alan mentioned, things are moving fast.
See what happens.
Our heels. If we sit and wait for the generative design revolution to confirm itself, we might be too late.
Sorry, what I meant was we have to wait and see if it is a revolution or not.
Okay. But besides, I'd like to. I've collaborated with some generative design projects. And one of the things I've noticed is that when they sometimes look into space syntax, they are very eager to look at space syntax, but they very naively expect space syntax to give them the answer, the solutions. What we see very often with generative design is they're very good at making things, but they're not very good at saying what the thing they're making is. It's clear that. One of the things that happens is when they adopt or look at space syntax, they think, okay, space syntax is an evaluation method that will tell us that red is good, so everything I get as red will be pursued, and everything I get as blue will be dropped. And so I think we need not, this has been mentioned, I think we also need to pay attention to that field and try to really, when we educate, you mentioned, try to educate really how to interpret and use these results, but also show them that it's linking back to that thing I said about understanding. It's a tool for understanding. It's not a tool for giving quick answers and quick solutions for their design, multiple design things that they generate. But definitely we should find ways of communicating with that group as well and helping them understand design using our tools and methods.
Yes, Susan.
Well, I feel the necessity to mention one aspect, and I'd like you to keep talking about that, is the way space syntax is always relating descriptions to social phenomena and how we are using statistics. And I think statistics is a very important aspect that should be looking for.
Sorry, you mean that we need to develop further statistical methods or use more statistical methods?
Yeah, when I mentioned methods, I didn't specifically say statistics, but certainly. And I say methods also in collaboration with experts, because there's experts who know so much about statistics, and sometimes laugh at our statistics, I have to admit. And so definitely we must do that. So when we start giving these jumps that are we're all very pleased to see these big jumps forward, but we also need to give them with the support of existing methods and existing statistics, for example.
I would also add what George mentioned, I'll say the necessity to sort of educate also with methods that have been developed in other disciplines. For example, sometimes we found ourselves reinventing things that graph theory had done before that we're not quite aware of, or the earliest, let's say, attempts by Stedman to summarize the models that were developed in biology, for example, as were then later translated into the study of architecture and build tools. So I think there is quite a studies, from mathematics, from network theory, and so on and so forth. I was actually very pleased to see the afternoon presentation the first day, the presentation that brought exactly that link from exams.
Maybe I understood your question differently from my colleagues here. I understood that you were asking about social phenomena, and I think there's two aspects to that. One is, I suppose, official data, official statistics, and I think the good news is there's much more of that around at the moment, particularly open source data. But I think the other aspect actually goes back to what Alan was saying about mining social data. And the first thing that comes to mind is that there's Saskia Krieger in the audience there. And she and I just wrote a paper on using information from the social media, so review websites, to effectively do a new kind of post-occupancy evaluation of buildings. So I'm very excited about the potential of things like social media, things like Twitter. Alan was talking about a presentation we've been at recently where the frequency of locations of photographs taken of places in Flickr were used to infer certain things about the urban fabric. So I think, what I find really exciting at the moment is there's so much more formal, official data out there, and that access to it is becoming easier, but that's balanced by this whole wealth of informal, bottom-up, crowdsourced data. And I think actually being able to tap into both, but also be reasonably critical about both, is actually important.
I truly hate to interrupt this lovely discussion, but our Korean hosts, they are telling me that we are getting late for dinner. So is there any last comment, a word of wisdom, or something that we can take? Who is taking that? Alan. You got the microphone.
Actually, it's a sort of a downer. Just something I wanted to say. Struck up by the question from Delft about generative. At the last conference in Chile, we remembered Alistair Turner, who sadly had died, and was a major inspiration, still being mentioned in this conference, and everybody is still working with his software. The other funeral I've been to this year is of Paul Coates. Now, Paul Coates was actually the first programmer who programmed syntax calculations in the 70s and 80s. But he also established the first main educational program at University of East London that did generative coding for architecture.